Get ready for the unknown. If you love feeling the chill down your spine and venturing into stories that will take your sleep away, subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell. Don't miss the next horror tales that will take you to the darkest corners of your mind. Are you ready to face your fears? Portal is open. Enter. It all started on a muggy August night. Sarah, lying in bed next to her husband David, woke up with a feeling of oppression in her chest. Her body was paralyzed, frozen in position, unable to move even her fingers. A sudden chill ran down her spine, contrasting with the stifling heat of the night. In the dimness of the room, his wide-eyed eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room. There he was, tall, motionless, with his wide-brimmed hat. His silhouette was almost indistinct, except for the iconic shape of the hat that stood out in the darkness. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. Terror suffocated her. The being didn't move, but the sense of threat was palpable. Her eyes were fixed on the figure, unable to look away, until as if her body had regained control, she managed to sit up, panting, but he was no longer there. David woke up to his wife's desperate sighs. "What is it, Sarah? A bad dream?" Sarah shakily tried to explain what she had seen, but David just laughed nervously. "It was just a dream. That's common in sleep paralysis." Despite his reassuring words, Sarah knew it hadn't been a dream. Something dark was lurking, something she felt deep inside her. The following night, the silence was interrupted by the footsteps of her son, Ethan, who entered the room with tear-stained eyes. "Mommy, there's a man in my room," he whispered, clutching the pillow tightly. Sarah and David exchanged worried glances, but got up to check. On entering the boys' room, they found nothing but the usual disarray of toys and an ajar window. David tried to reassure his son that it was just a dream, but Sarah felt the same icy chill that had enveloped her the night before. "What was he like, son?" she asked, her voice breaking. He wore a big hat and looked at me from the doorway," replied Ethan, his face pale. Sarah's heart raced and her eyes filled with tears. There was no way he could have known about his mother's vision, but the story was exactly the same. David, visibly skeptical, insisted that it was just a coincidence. "We're all being suggested by these nightmares. Tomorrow we'll change our routine, maybe go on a trip," he said, trying to sound rational. But throughout that night, Sarah became alert. She knew something was very wrong. The man in the hat was coming, closer and closer. The following nights were filled with constant restlessness. Sarah could hardly sleep. David's footsteps beside her, which had once brought comfort, now seemed distant. One early morning, as she watched the darkness, she saw him again. This time, he was closer, at the edge of the bed. The dim moonlight came through the window but didn't reveal his face. Just that wide-brimmed hat, tilting slowly in her direction, as if he were watching her from a macabre vantage point. She tried to wake David, but her words died in her throat. She couldn't move her arms, she couldn't breathe. The seconds seemed to drag on for an eternity. Sarah's eyes watered with dread as the man in the hat stood there, motionless, sucking all the heat out of the room. Then, in the blink of an eye, he disappeared. The next morning, Sarah confronted David with what had happened, but he gave her a worried look. "You're stressing yourself too much. We need professional help," he said, insisting that it was just Sarah's mind creating these visions. But she knew it wasn't madness. She knew he was there, waiting, watching. Weeks passed, and the presence of the man in the hat became more frequent. Ethan started talking less and becoming withdrawn, as if something was constantly terrorizing him. At school, he had trouble concentrating and avoided sleeping at home. The terror Sarah felt was reflected in her son, and now David was also beginning to show signs of fear. He wouldn't admit it, but he would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, looking around as if he was searching for something. Sarah, desperate, decided to seek spiritual help. She went to a local church where a priest listened carefully to her story. "What you describe is no ordinary spirit," he said, his expression serious. "There are ancient legends about an entity that appears during periods of great suffering. The man in the hat, as they call him, is no mere ghost. He feeds on fear, on human weakness. When he appears, it's because something much worse is coming." Hearing these words, Sarah felt her heart squeeze. It all made sense now. The man in the hat wasn't just a vision or a nightmare. He was the herald of something more terrible, something she couldn't name, but could feel approaching. She needed to act fast, or she would lose more than just nights of sleep. That night, Sarah decided to stay awake, keeping an eye on Ethan's room. She knew the man in the hat would come, but this time she was determined to face him. The clock struck 3 a.m. when the air in the room turned icy cold. In the corner he appeared again, now clearly visible in the dim light. His hat still hid his face, but Sarah could feel his eyes fixed on her, piercing her soul. With a strength she didn't know she had, she stood up. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The man in the hat remained motionless, but then something changed. A grotesque smile formed on his face, something inhuman, a dark reflection of his own evil. Suddenly he disappeared, but Ethan's room was empty. His son was no longer there. Terror gripped Sarah as the house filled with distant screams from every corner. The man in the hat had taken Ethan, and now Sarah knew he wouldn't stop there. She had fallen into a much bigger trap than she could have imagined. The real terror wasn't the figure in the hat that had tormented her for weeks, but the fact that he was just the beginning of something much more evil, and she couldn't escape it. The clock struck 3:15, and silence dominated the house forever. When Sarah realized that Ethan had disappeared, a feeling of absolute emptiness enveloped her. The room, which had once been her son's refuge, now seemed like a black hole, sucking away all remaining hope. Desperate, she ran through the house, shouting his name, but found only silence. The man in the hat had taken her son to a place she couldn't reach, a place beyond reality. That same night, as Sarah cried out in anguish, something strange happened. She heard a faint whisper coming from Ethan's room. "Mom?" The voice was familiar but distorted, as if it came from a great distance. As she ran into the room, she came across a small figure with its back to her, in the corner where the man in the hat usually appeared. "Ethan!" she shouted, her heart beating wildly. But when the figure turned around, it wasn't her son standing there. It was a distorted version, with empty eyes and a pale expression. "He got me," said the figure, its voice hoarse and distant. Sarah stepped back, shocked. That wasn't Ethan, but a shadow, a dark reflection of what he had been. She felt that her son was trapped in a place between life and death, abducted by the entity that tormented them. With the help of the local priest, Sarah began to investigate the stories about missing children linked to the man in the hat. She discovered that, over the decades, countless families had reported their children missing after seeing visions of the figure. "He doesn't just take them away," explained the priest. "He imprisons them in limbo, a place between life and death, where he feeds on their souls." Desperate for answers, Sarah began to have strange visions in her dreams. She saw Ethan in a misty place, a kind of gray world where time didn't exist. He wasn't alone. Other children wandered through this space, all with the same empty stare. Every time Sarah tried to reach Ethan in her dreams, he would pull away, pulled by an invisible force. The priest warned her that coming into contact with this place would be dangerous. "It's not a world where humans should tread," he said. "But if you really want to save your son, you'll have to make a sacrifice." Without hesitation, Sarah decided to go all the way. Ethan was everything to her, and, despite her terror, she knew she had to try and rescue him. As Sarah delved deeper into her investigations, a shocking discovery changed everything. In an old box found in the basement of her house, she unearthed old photos from the 1920s. In one of the photos, there was a figure in a black hat, with the same sinister silhouette that she and her family had been seeing. Next to him, a woman was smiling at the camera. A woman who, with a shock, Sarah recognized as her great-grandmother. Further on in the photos, she saw something even more disturbing. A child who looked very much like her, but was from another era. That can't be," she muttered, as she tried to understand the connection. Leafing through the pages of an old family diary, Sarah discovered a hidden story. Her great-grandmother, a woman called Margaret, had made a pact with a dark entity to protect her bloodline from an ancestral curse. The man in the hat was the guardian of this pact, and he returned every generation demanding a sacrifice. Sarah realized that her son, Ethan, was the price to be paid. The man in the hat wasn't just any entity. He was tied to his family's blood, a shadow that had followed them for generations. Determined to rescue Ethan, Sarah confronted the truth. To break the pact, she would have to face the man in the hat directly, in a confrontation that would push her to the limits of what is considered human. With the priest's help, she performed an ancient ritual, a mixture of ancient magic and prayer, designed to open a portal to the limbo where Ethan was trapped. That night, Sarah stayed alone in her house, surrounded by candles and symbols of protection. The air around her became thick, almost unbearable, and then he appeared. The man in the hat, more imposing and terrifying than ever, appeared in the center of the room. This time, he wasn't just watching, he spoke. "You've come to break the cycle, Sarah." His voice was a cold whisper, like wind through dead trees. "Your family has owed me for generations. Your son is just the beginning. Now, it's your turn to pay." Sarah, despite the fear that consumed her body, stood up. "You won't have any more of my family. No more," she shouted, facing the creature. The man in the hat stepped forward, extending a skeletal hand towards her. "Then come, pay the price with your own soul." In the final moment, Sarah understood the sacrifice she would have to make. To save Ethan, she would have to give herself up completely. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Take me, but free my son." The entity stopped, tilting its head as if considering her offer. The atmosphere turned icy, and Sarah felt her soul being pulled, as if it were being ripped from her body. But before the man in the hat could consummate it, something unexpected happened. Ethan, in a vision of purity, appeared in limbo beside her. "Mom, no," he shouted, running towards her. The love between mother and son broke through the barrier that the man in the hat had created. The emotional connection between them was stronger than any dark pact. The entity retreated with a guttural roar of rage. The cycle had finally been broken. The limbo began to crumble, and Ethan was freed from the control of the man in the hat. Sarah collapsed, exhausted, but woke up in Ethan's room with her son in her arms, alive. The man in the hat disappeared forever, taking the family's cursed pact with him. However, in the back of her mind, Sarah knew that evil was never completely defeated. It just lay dormant, waiting for another chance.